The Galactic Defense Academy prided itself on producing the finest military officers the known universe had ever seen, which was quite the boast, considering the universe had seen some spectacularly incompetent military leadership over the millennia. Nestled on Nexus Prime, the Academy floated in space like a chrome-plated testament to interspecies cooperation. Or at least, the illusion of it. The established military dynasties had been perfecting organized violence for centuries. The Krillians had their bone-deep understanding of siege warfare, the Vorthan possessed supernatural fleet coordination abilities, and the Zelkari could plan ambushes that would make spiders jealous. Then there were the humans, the galactic equivalent of that enthusiastic cousin who shows up to family dinner uninvited and somehow ends up doing the dishes. Humanity's recent admission to the Galactic Defense Consortium had been met with polite skepticism typically reserved for dubious restaurant recommendations. Sure, they'd proven themselves capable of not immediately destroying their own planet, which was more than could be said for several species currently holding senior military positions, but actual combat experience? Strategic thinking beyond point the sharp end at the enemy. The jury was taking an extended lunch break. Unit patches decorated cadet uniforms like badges of inherited honor. These weren't mere decorations. They were sacred symbols representing military units that had carved their names into galactic history through blood, sacrifice, and occasional clerical errors that resulted in legendary status. The most prestigious patches commanded immediate respect and considerable envy. The 7th Voidstalkers, elite reconnaissance specialists who had seen action in conflicts most beings couldn't even pronounce. These units didn't just fight wars, they defined them. Commander Zefrak represented everything the Academy aspired to produce, assuming what it aspired to produce was arrogant, self-aggrandizing military instructors with questionable storytelling abilities. The 7-foot Krillian's exoskeleton bore carefully maintained scars from numerous conflicts, displayed like a living museum of combat experience. His reputation preceded him through Academy halls like an unwelcome house guest. The sole survivor of the Kepler 442 massacre, hero of the Outer Rim campaigns, tactical genius whose strategies were studied across 3 sectors. At least that was what the promotional materials claimed. Zefrak had cultivated his legend with dedication, of a master gardener tending prize-winning roses. Every retelling grew more elaborate, more dramatic, more heroic. The details shifted like desert sand, but the core remained constant. He was the brilliant tactician, who had somehow survived when everyone else had fallen. The 7th Voidstalker's patch on his uniform served as physical proof of his claims. The insignia depicted a stylized predator emerging from star-hilled darkness, its eyes gleaming with distant starlight. It was beautiful military artistry, made more beautiful by the prestige it represented. His teaching methods reflected his personality with the subtlety of a plasma cannon. Tactical warfare wasn't merely a subject to be studied, it was a sacred art form to be revered, and he was its most accomplished practitioner. His lectures combined technical instruction with personal anecdotes, strategic analysis with heroic narratives, and educational content with shameless self-promotion. Students learned about military tactics, but they learned even more about Commander Zefrak's extraordinary career. The human cadets who found themselves in his courses quickly discovered that their species' military capabilities were a frequent subject of discussion, usually in the context of what not to do in combat situations. Humanity's brief galactic military history provided excellent examples of enthusiasm overcoming experience, courage substituting for competence, and the remarkable ability to achieve victory through methods that violated several fundamental principles of warfare. Marcus Reeves possessed the remarkable ability to blend into any crowd, quite an achievement considering he was often the only human in that crowd. Where alien classmates displayed their heritage through towering height, natural armor, or intimidating features, Reeves presented the visual equivalent of beige wallpaper. This anonymity served him well during his first weeks at the Academy. While other cadets struggled with intense instructor scrutiny and interspecies social dynamics, Reeves simply existed in the background, observing, learning, and carefully avoiding attention. His fellow cadets' reactions ranged from polite indifference to barely concealed skepticism. The Krielians viewed him as a curiosity, the Vorthan treated him with patient tolerance typically reserved for children in adult conversations, and the Zelkari mostly ignored him, which was actually the closest thing to acceptance he could expect. Reeves' uniform bore standard academy insignia, but tucked among regulation badges was something that would have drawn considerable attention if anyone had bothered to look closely: a small, well-worn patch depicting a stylized predator emerging from star-hilled darkness, its eyes gleaming with distant starlight. The patch showed genuine wear, edges softened by handling, colors faded from exposure, fabric worn thin where it had been repeatedly folded and stored. But Reeves kept this particular detail to himself, just as he kept most details about his background to himself. The Academy's admission files contained the basic information required for enrollment: previous education, aptitude test scores, medical clearances, and psychological evaluations. They didn't delve deeply into personal history, especially for species like humans, whose military records were relatively brief and largely classified. His classmates occasionally attempted to draw him into conversations about pre-academy experiences, but Reeves possessed a talent for deflecting such inquiries without appearing evasive. He would ask questions about their backgrounds, express interest in their homeworlds, and somehow manage to avoid reciprocating with personal information. It was a social skill that served him well in an environment where standing out could be dangerous. The tactical warfare classroom hummed with advanced technology designed to accommodate 17 different species' anatomical requirements. Commander Zefrak entered with theatrical flair, his movements calculated to project confidence, authority, and barely contained violence. "Combat," he announced, "is the ultimate test of tactical thinking. When plasma fire is cutting through the air and your comrades are falling, theory becomes irrelevant. Only experience matters." He activated the holographic display, filling the classroom with the ghostly image of a star system. 3 planets orbited a dying star, their surfaces scarred by massive conflicts. "Right, the Kepler 442 system," Zefrak continued reverentially. 3 worlds, rich in rare minerals, strategically positioned along major shipping routes, defended by sophisticated military installations. It should have been impregnable. The display shifted, showing fleet movements and tactical formations. Ships moved through space with deadly precision, their weapons systems painting targeting solutions across the darkness. The 7th Voidstalkers were deployed as advance reconnaissance, Zefrak explained. Our mission was to gather intelligence on enemy defensive capabilities and identify potential weaknesses. Standard procedure for elite units. Get in, assess the situation, report back to command. He paused dramatically. But intelligence failures are constant in warfare. What command believed to be a defensive installation was actually a massive trap. The enemy had been expecting us, had prepared for our arrival, had turned our own tactical advantages against us. The holographic display exploded into chaos. Ships erupted in brilliant flashes, their destruction rendered in beautiful, terrible detail. Organized formations dissolved into desperate struggles for survival. The massacre lasted 17 hours, Zefrak whispered. 17 hours of continuous combat against an enemy that seemed to anticipate our every move. Ships that had survived decades of conflict were reduced to debris in minutes. The cadets sat in stunned silence, absorbing the magnitude of the disaster. The 7th Voidstalkers were among the first units targeted, Zefrak continued. Elite reconnaissance specialists, masters of stealth and infiltration, reduced to sitting targets in a carefully orchestrated ambush. One by one, they fell to enemy fire. He gestured to his patch. "I wear this insignia not as a symbol of pride, but as a reminder of warfare's cost. I am the sole survivor of that engagement, the only member of my unit to escape the killing field of Kepler 442. The room remained silent as cadets processed this revelation. Here was living history, a being who had witnessed one of the most significant military disasters in recent galactic memory. The weight of his survival, the burden of carrying on his unit's legacy, the responsibility of learning from such catastrophic failure. It was almost too much to comprehend. "Human military doctrine," Zefrak added, his tone shifting to something approaching disdain. Emphasizes courage over caution, aggression over analysis. In theoretical combat situations, such approaches can appear admirable. In reality, they lead to unnecessary casualties and tactical disasters. Several of the alien cadets turned to look at the human members of their class, their expressions mixing curiosity with something that might have been pity. The humans, for their part, maintained careful, neutral expressions, neither confirming nor denying the instructor's assessment of their species' military capabilities. The lesson here, Zefrak concluded, is that survival in combat requires more than bravery. It requires tactical thinking, strategic planning, and the wisdom to recognize when a situation has become untenable. Heroes who die in glorious charges are still dead. It was during this moment of profound military instruction that Commander Zefrak's attention was drawn to something that shouldn't have been there. A patch on one of the human cadets' uniforms, partially obscured, but clearly visible to an instructor trained to observe details. The patch depicted a stylized predator emerging from star-hilled darkness, its eyes gleaming with distant starlight. It was identical to the one Zefrak wore, down to the smallest detail. But that should have been impossible. The 7th Voidstalkers had been completely destroyed at Kepler 442. He was the sole survivor. Zefrak's lecture faltered as he processed what he was seeing. His voice, which had carried the authority of hard-won experience, suddenly sounded less certain. "Cadet," Zefrak said sharply, "stand up." Marcus Reeves looked up from his notes, showing mild surprise at being singled out. Around him, other cadets turned to see what had caught their instructor's attention. "I said, stand up," Zefrak repeated. Reeves complied, rising with easy military grace. As he stood, the patch became fully visible to everyone. Several cadets gasped as they recognized the insignia. "Explain that patch," Zefrak demanded. Reeves looked down at his uniform, then back at the instructor. His expression remained calm, but something in his eyes suggested he had been expecting this moment. "It's a 7th Voidstalker's patch, sir," he said simply. "I can see what it is," Zefrak snapped. "I want to know how you came to possess it. That insignia represents a unit that was completely destroyed. I am the sole survivor of that engagement." The classroom fell silent, except for the quiet hum of holographic displays. Every cadet focused on the confrontation, sensing they were witnessing something far more significant than a uniform violation. "The patch is authentic, sir," Reeves replied steadily. "Authentic?" Zefrak's voice rose. "That's impossible. The 7th Voidstalkers were eliminated at Kepler 442. Every member except myself was killed in the massacre." "With respect, sir," Reeves said quietly, "that's not accurate." The words hung in the air like a challenge to everything Zefrak had just told them. The instructor's face went through several color changes as he processed the implications. "Not accurate?" Zefrak repeated dangerously. "Are you suggesting that I'm lying about my own experiences? That I've somehow fabricated my survival of one of the most significant military disasters in recent history?" "I'm suggesting," Reeves said carefully, "that your recollection of events might be incomplete." The confrontation had moved beyond a simple classroom exchange. This was now a direct challenge to Zefrak's authority, his reputation, and the foundation of his identity as a war hero. "My recollection," Zefrak said menacingly, "is perfect. I was there. I lived through it. I watched my comrades die while I fought to survive against impossible odds." "You were there," Reeves agreed, "but you weren't the only survivor." The statement hit the classroom like a physical blow. Several cadets looked between the instructor and the human cadet, trying to understand what they were witnessing. "Possible," Zefrak whispered, but his voice lacked conviction. "The 7th Voidstalkers weren't completely destroyed at Kepler 4442, Reeves continued. 17 members were killed in the initial ambush. 3 more died during the fighting, but the remaining members were extracted by a joint rescue operation conducted by human naval forces and the Vorthan Emergency Response Fleet. The words fell into the silence like stones into still water, creating ripples of shock throughout the classroom. Zefrak's face went through another series of color changes, settling on something approaching gray. That's "That's not what happened," he said, but his voice sounded hollow. "The rescue operation was designated Code 77 Alpha," Reeves continued, his tone remaining conversational despite the explosive nature of his revelations. "It was launched 36 hours after the initial assault, when long-range sensors detected survival signals from the Kepler 442 system. The operation involved 12 ships from 3 different species, including the human vessel designation Norfolk." Zephrak's legs seemed to give out slightly, and he gripped the edge of his desk for support. The carefully constructed narrative of his heroic survival was crumbling around him, and he appeared to be struggling to process the implications. "I don't understand," he whispered. "The records, the official reports, they all confirmed that I was the sole survivor." "The official reports were classified," Reeves explained. "The rescue operation wasn't supposed to have been necessary. The fact that it was required represented a significant intelligence failure at the highest levels of command. Rather than acknowledge the mistakes that led to the disaster, the decision was made to simplify the narrative." The holographic display was still showing the aftermath of the Kepler 442 battle, but now the images seemed to mock the story that had just been told. The destruction was real, the casualties were real, but the explanation for how anyone had survived was apparently far more complex than a single hero's miraculous escape. "But the commendations," Zephrak said, his voice growing desperate. "The medals, the recognition, the teaching position here at the Academy. They wouldn't have given me those honors if—" "You were given those honors," Reeves interrupted gently, "because you were the only survivor willing to accept them." The statement hit the classroom like a second shockwave. The implications were staggering. Not only had Zephrak not been the sole survivor of the massacre, but he had apparently been the only survivor willing to build a career on the tragedy. "The other survivors," Reeves continued, "chose to remain anonymous. They were offered commendations, promotions, teaching positions, media interviews. They declined. They wanted to return to active duty, to continue serving without the burden of being treated as living monuments to military failure." Zephrak looked around the classroom, his gaze moving from one cadet to another as if seeking support or understanding, but the expressions he saw reflected confusion, disappointment, and growing suspicion. The foundation of his authority as an instructor was crumbling, and everyone could see it happening. "How do you know this?" he asked, his voice barely audible. Reeves reached into his uniform pocket and withdrew a small device. With a few quick movements he activated it, and the air above his hand shimmered with a holographic display. The image showed a younger version of himself in military gear, standing alongside other soldiers in what appeared to be the aftermath of a rescue operation. "I know this," he said quietly, "because I was part of the rescue team that pulled you out of the wreckage of your command post on Kepler 424. The revelation hit the classroom like a third shockwave, more powerful than the previous two combined. The cadets sat in stunned silence, their minds struggling to process what they had just learned. Their instructor, the war hero who had been teaching them about tactical excellence and military honor, had been rescued by the very human forces he had been disparaging. "The Norfolk was my ship," Reeve continued, his voice taking on the tone of someone recounting a mission briefing. "I was a petty officer in the reconnaissance division. Our unit was responsible for locating and extracting survivors from the battlefield." The holographic display shifted, showing tactical maps and rescue coordinates. The detail was extraordinary, far beyond what could be fabricated or misremembered. This was clearly authentic military documentation, the kind that would be found in classified mission files. "We found you in the ruins of Forward Operating Base 7, Reeves said, his voice remaining calm despite the magnitude of his revelations. "You were unconscious, suffering from plasma burns and severe dehydration. You'd been trapped under debris for almost 2 days." Zephrak's face went completely white, as memories he had apparently suppressed began to surface. The carefully constructed narrative of his heroic survival was being replaced by the more mundane reality of being rescued by forces he had spent years claiming were inferior. "You were delirious when we found you," Reeves continued. "You kept talking about fighting off enemy boarding parties, about single-handedly holding your position against overwhelming odds. The medics said it was trauma response. that survivors often create elaborate narratives to cope with the psychological impact of their experiences. The classroom remained silent, except for the quiet hum of the holographic display. The cadets were witnessing the complete destruction of their instructor's credibility, and none of them seemed to know how to respond. The other survivors we rescued, Reeves added, chose to deal with their trauma differently. They accepted counseling, processed their experiences honestly, and moved forward with their careers. They didn't try to turn their survival into a foundation for personal glory. Zephrak's hands were shaking as he gripped the edge of his desk. His entire identity as a war hero, his teaching position, his reputation throughout the academy, all of it was built on a narrative that had just been revealed as fundamentally false. "I don't remember," he whispered. "I don't remember being rescued. I remember fighting, surviving, escaping on my own." "Trauma does that," Reeves said, his voice surprisingly gentle. "It creates false memories, fills in gaps with narratives that feel more acceptable than the truth. The human mind is remarkably good at protecting itself from experiences that are too difficult to process." The explanation was compassionate, but it didn't change the fundamental reality of what had just been revealed. Zephrak's heroic survival story was a psychological construct, a way of coping with the trauma of being helpless and dependent on others for rescue. "Why didn't you say anything before?" Zephrak asked, his voice hollow. "Because it wasn't my place," Reeves replied. "Your survival story wasn't hurting anyone. It was giving you a sense of purpose, a way to contribute to military education. I saw no reason to destroy that unless it became necessary. And now it's necessary? Now you're using your fabricated experience to diminish the capabilities of the forces that saved your life," Reeves said, his voice taking on a harder edge. "You're teaching cadets that human military doctrine is inferior, that our tactics are flawed, that our courage is meaningless. That's not education, that's prejudice disguised as instruction." The words hit their target with devastating accuracy. Zephrak's lectures had indeed been filled with dismissive comments about human military capabilities, often delivered with the authority of someone who claimed to have superior combat experience, but that authority was now revealed to be hollow. "The 7th Voidstalkers," Reeves continued, "were an elite unit. They deserved better than to have their legacy built on a lie. The beings who died in that battle deserved better than to be remembered as part of a fabricated heroic narrative." The holographic display shifted again, showing images of the actual 7th Voidstalkers unit. These were the real soldiers, the actual heroes who had died at Kepler 442. Their faces looked back at the classroom with the quiet dignity of those who had made the ultimate sacrifice in service of their beliefs. "I've been carrying this patch," Reeves said, touching the insignia on his uniform, "not as a trophy, but as a reminder that real heroism doesn't require exaggeration or fabrication. It doesn't need to diminish others to seem more impressive." The confrontation had moved beyond personal revelation into something approaching a moral reckoning. The cadets were witnessing not just the exposure of their instructor's lies, but a lesson in the difference between authentic honor and manufactured glory. "What happens now?" Zephrak asked, his voice barely a whisper. "Now," Reeves said, "you have a choice. You can continue building your career on false narratives, or you can find a way to contribute to military education based on truth rather than fabrication." The suggestion was offered without malice, but it carried the weight of an ultimatum. Zephrak could either acknowledge the truth and find a way to rebuild his reputation on an honest foundation, or he could continue living the lie and risk further exposure. "I don't know how," Zephrak admitted. Stop using your fabricated experience to criticize the forces that saved your life," Reeves suggested. "Start by teaching tactics based on documented military history rather than personal mythology. Start by treating your students with respect rather than using them as an audience for your war stories." The recommendations were practical, achievable, and devastating in their simplicity. They required Zephrak to abandon the foundation of his identity as an instructor, but they also offered a path toward redemption, based on honest contribution rather than manufactured heroism. The classroom remained silent as the implications of the confrontation settled over everyone present. The cadets had witnessed something far more significant than a simple academic lecture. They had seen the difference between authentic military service and the kind of self-aggrandizing mythology that sometimes grows around traumatic experiences. The Academy's investigation into the Kepler 442 incident was swift, thorough, and embarrassing for everyone involved. Military records were reviewed, classified files were declassified, and witness statements were collected from the survivors of the rescue operation. The truth, as truth often does, proved to be far more complex and less flattering than the simplified narrative that had been accepted for years. Commander Zefrak's fabricated heroic survival story unraveled completely under official scrutiny. The psychological evaluations revealed the extent to which trauma had distorted his memories, creating a narrative that allowed him to cope with the reality of his helplessness during the battle. The Academy's administration faced the uncomfortable task of dealing with an instructor whose credentials were built on false premises. The situation was handled with the kind of diplomatic delicacy that military institutions use when dealing with embarrassing revelations. Zefrak was quietly reassigned to a position that didn't involve teaching or public speaking. His commendations were reviewed, and while they weren't revoked, they were placed in a more appropriate context. The official record was corrected to reflect the actual events of the rescue operation. The broader implications of the incident rippled through the Academy's culture in ways that would take months to fully understand. The revelation that a respected instructor had been teaching from false premises raised questions about the vetting process for military educators. The fact that his fabricated expertise had been used to disparage human military capabilities created diplomatic tensions that required careful management. But perhaps the most significant impact was on the cadets, who had witnessed the confrontation. They had seen firsthand the difference between authentic military service and the kind of manufactured heroism that sometimes passes for qualification. They had learned that real courage doesn't require exaggeration, that genuine expertise doesn't need to diminish others, and that the most impressive military service is often performed by those who prefer to remain anonymous. Marcus Reeves found himself in the awkward position of being celebrated for exposing a fraud while trying to maintain the low profile that had served him well throughout his academy career. The other cadets' attitudes toward him shifted from polite indifference to respectful curiosity, but he managed to deflect most attempts to learn more about his background. The Academy's administration offered him commendations, advanced placement, and opportunities for accelerated promotion. He declined them all, preferring to complete his education at the standard pace and return to active duty without the burden of being treated as a celebrity. His response to the situation reflected the same quiet competence that had characterized his approach to academy life. The human cadets at the academy found that their instructors' attitudes toward their species' military capabilities became noticeably less dismissive. The revelation that human forces had conducted successful rescue operations in one of the most challenging combat environments in recent history couldn't be ignored or minimized. The tactical doctrine that had been criticized as overly aggressive was re-examined in light of its demonstrated effectiveness. The 7th Voidstalkers unit received posthumous recognition for their service and sacrifice at Kepler 42. Their actual story, without the fabricated heroic narrative that had been built around Zefrak's survival, proved to be more inspiring than the false version. They were remembered as soldiers who had died in service of their mission, not as props in someone else's heroic mythology. The Academy's curriculum was quietly updated to include more accurate information about human military capabilities and tactical doctrine. The rescue operation at Kepler 442 became a case study in interspecies cooperation and the importance of maintaining rescue capabilities, even in the most challenging combat environments. The lessons learned from the incident were incorporated into training programs across the Galactic defense establishment. The irony of the situation wasn't lost on the Academy's more observant faculty members. An instructor who had spent years using fabricated expertise to criticize human military capabilities had been exposed by a human cadet who possessed actual experience with the events in question. The student had become the teacher, and the teacher had been revealed as someone who had much to learn about honesty, humility, and the true nature of military service. Commander Zephrak's departure from the academy was handled with minimal fanfare. He simply stopped appearing in classrooms, his name was quietly removed from faculty directories, and his office was reassigned to someone else. The cadets who had been in his classes were informed that their tactical warfare instruction would be provided by a different instructor, one whose credentials were based on documented rather than fabricated experience. The new instructor turned out to be a Vorthan officer who had actually served in combat operations, had never claimed to be a hero, and treated students from all species with equal respect. The tactical warfare lessons continued, but they were based on actual military history rather than personal mythology. Marcus Reeves completed his academy education with the same quiet competence that had characterized his entire time at the institution. He graduated with honors, received assignment to a reconnaissance unit, and departed for active duty without giving any interviews or making any public statements about his role in exposing the false narrative surrounding the Kepler 442 incident. The patch on his uniform, the authentic 7th Voidstalker's insignia, remained a small, worn reminder of the price of real military service. But unlike his former instructor, Reeves wore it as a tribute to those who had died, not as a foundation for personal glory. The academy returned to its normal routine of training future military officers, but the lessons learned from the Zephrak incident became part of its institutional memory. The importance of verifying credentials, the danger of allowing fabricated expertise to guide education, and the value of authentic military service over manufactured heroism were all incorporated into the academy's culture. The galaxy continued to turn, conflicts continued to arise, and the need for skilled military officers remained constant. But at the Galactic Defense Academy, at least, there was a slightly better understanding of the difference between genuine military service and the kind of self-aggrandizing mythology that sometimes grows around traumatic experiences. And in the end, that understanding proved to be more valuable than any number of fabricated heroic narratives. The universe, it seemed, had a sense of irony after all.